They wore the garments of priests. They stood near the altar. They were raised around the things of God, but they didn't know him. They knew the rituals, but not the relationship. They served in the tabernacle, but didn't fear the one who dwelled in it. They were born in church, but died lost. This is the tragic story of Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. And it could be your story, if you're not careful. Long before Israel had kings, they had priests. And among them stood a man named Eli, a spiritual leader chosen by God. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was faithful, at least in the beginning. He served in Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood. The Ark of the Covenant rested there. It was the holiest place in Israel, the place where God's presence met man. Eli ministered there day and night. He offered sacrifices. He burned incense. He taught the people. He judged the nation. And in this holy atmosphere, his sons were raised, Hophni and Phinehas, born into the priesthood, born into a legacy of worship, born into a rhythm of sacrifice, prayer, and reverence. They weren't outsiders. They didn't come in off the streets. They lived in the presence of God. They saw the garments. They watched the fire on the altar. They heard the scriptures read aloud. They memorized the law of Moses, not as students, but as sons of a priest. To the public, they were the future of Israel's priesthood. Everything about them looked right. They were clothed in linen ephods. They stood next to their father during ceremonies. They watched pilgrims come from every tribe, bringing lambs, doves, and grain offerings. They knew what holiness looked like. They knew what worship sounded like. They knew the system of sacrifice inside and out. But somewhere deep in their hearts, they did not know the God behind it all. 1 Samuel 2:12 says, "Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord." That one sentence unravels everything, because you can be in the right place, doing the right things, with the wrong heart. Hophni and Phinehas performed the rituals, but they had no relationship. They were surrounded by God's presence, but they were far from him. And that, right there, is the seed of every spiritual fall. Familiarity without fear. Exposure without intimacy. Proximity without obedience. The priesthood wasn't a career. It wasn't a job you clocked in and out of. It was a calling, a divine assignment passed down through the line of Aaron. God had given clear instructions, down to the smallest detail, about how sacrifices were to be handled, how offerings were to be burned, how meat was to be shared. Every action at the altar was sacred. It reflected the covenant between God and his people. But to Hophni and Phinehas, it became routine. They began to see holy things as ordinary. The fire of reverence faded, and in its place grew entitlement, greed, and lust. They were priests, but they became predators. When the Israelites brought their peace offerings, a portion was to go to the Lord, a portion burned, and only a regulated part given to the priest. But Hophni and Phinehas, they sent their servant in with a fork, not after the fat was burned, but before, demanding raw meat so they could cook it how they pleased. And if someone who actually feared God, objected, they were threatened. 1 Samuel 2:16 says, "If the man said to him, 'Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want,' the servant would answer, 'No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force.'" They turned worship into extortion. The house of prayer became a house of power plays. But it didn't stop there. They began to sleep with the women who served at the entrance to the tabernacle. These were likely women devoted to helping in the Lord's work, servants of God's sanctuary. But to Hophni and Phinehas, they were objects, used, defiled, forgotten. What was sacred became profane. They sinned not in secret, but in full view of the people. And worse, they sinned in full view of God. 1 Samuel 2:17 says, "The sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt." This wasn't just moral failure. This was spiritual treason. They had been given access to the holiest things on earth, and they used that access to satisfy their flesh. And Eli, he heard about it. He knew what was happening. He called them out. But words were not enough. He rebuked them, but he didn't remove them, and that silence became permission. God sent a prophet to Eli with a chilling message. "You honor your sons more than me. Therefore the days are coming when I will cut off your strength." 1 Samuel 2:29-31. Then God said something terrifying. "I swore that the sin of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." 1 Samuel 3:14. And still, they didn't change. Hophni and Phinehas kept sinning. Eli stayed silent, and the clock of mercy kept ticking until the day it stopped. Then came the words no priest would ever want to hear. "I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who will do according to what is in my heart and mind." God was done waiting. He would raise someone else. And to prove it, he gave a terrifying sign. "What happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day." 1 Samuel 2:34. Eli heard it, but again, he stayed silent. And then, the day came. The Philistines gathered for war. Israel marched out to meet them, confident, proud. They believed that if they brought the Ark of the Covenant into battle, God would fight for them. But what they didn't realize was that God doesn't bless what he's no longer part of. They weren't carrying a presence, they were carrying a box. Hophni and Phinehas were there, marching beside the ark, not as men of God, but as men carrying stolen authority. The battle began, and Israel was defeated, slaughtered. 30,000 men died, the ark of God was captured, and just as God had spoken, Hophni and Phinehas both died on the same day. When word reached Eli, he sat on his chair by the road, old, blind, heavy with grief. And when he heard the ark had been captured, he fell backward, broke his neck, and died. That day, a priestly line ended, and the cry of judgment echoed across Israel. Ichabod. The glory has departed. How did it come to this? They weren't pagan kings. They weren't idol worshippers from foreign lands. They were church boys, ministers' kids, sons of the high priest, but they never knew the Lord. 1 Samuel 2:12 says, "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord." That's the tragedy. You can grow up in church and still die far from God. You can wear the robe, hold the mic, lead the prayer, and still never surrender your heart. Today there are thousands, even millions, just like Hophni and Phinehas. You grew up in church, you went to Sunday school, you memorized verses, you could recite Psalm 23 from the age of 7. But somewhere along the line, you never really met God for yourself. You know how to perform faith, but you don't know how to walk with God. And without that personal relationship, church becomes a stage, and your heart drifts, just like Eli's sons. They took the offerings for themselves. They slept with the women at the entrance of the tabernacle. They mocked the holiness of God while standing in his house. It started with entitlement. It ended in destruction. If this message hits close to home, maybe it's because God is knocking on the door of your heart today. It's not too late to start again, not too late to come back. not too late to know him for real. Jesus didn't die to make you religious. He died to bring you into relationship. Don't end up like the sons of Eli. Don't let your legacy be one of wasted opportunity. Don't grow up in the house of God and still die without him. You can know God for real, not through religion, not through rituals, but through surrender. Don't just grow up in church. Grow into Christ. Did you enjoy this story time? Subscribe for more Bible-based stories that pierce the heart. And turn on notifications to never miss more stories like this from God's Word.